Hello and welcome to this video tutorial. My name is Ron Vellon, and today we're going to be continuing with our discussion of integrative negotiation. This is part 2. So in part 1 we had a look at the overall approach to integrative negotiation along with a focused discussion on the importance of interests. In part 2 we're going to look at the specific strategies of integrative negotiation. We're also going to look at the main tactics. Just a note here that tactics, when we talk about integrative negotiation, are a bit more fluid than they are in distributive bargaining. In other words, it's likely that the tactics are more easily interwoven into the strategies as things we might do all the time. So what we're going to focus on is how to emphasize a couple of primary strategies in your plan and making sure you make those the priority so it's clear for you when you're actually in a negotiation. We're going to look at ways to generate and evaluate solutions and options in an integrative situation and how to weave that into your overall negotiation process. We're also going to look at ways to conclude an integrative negotiation in a couple of ways that are tactics, but not ones you can necessarily plan for. So let's begin by looking at the main strategies of integrative negotiation. I want to quickly point out that as we go through the strategies and tactics of integrative negotiation, it's important to keep this image in mind. This is the Pareto efficient frontier. This is the model we were discussing in part 1 that looks at this relationship between creating value and claiming value. Just keep that in mind, and we'll refer back to it periodically because these strategies and tactics are very much about working with this idea of being creative as well as reaching a good agreement for yourself. With integrative negotiation, there are 7 main strategies. And what we find with integrative negotiation is these strategies are highly complementary. In distributive bargaining, some strategies, there's really 4 main ones and 3 that we tend to use more often. They tend to be similar looks at something that is essentially the same thing, all about the resistance point. With these strategies, they can all be quite different and yet very complementary with each other. So if you choose to start with, or 1 or 2 to start with in a plan, it's not unusual to fold in others in the middle of a negotiation when you see that you need to go a different route. But it doesn't really contradict the other strategies you've already implemented. So the first one is to create a common objective or goal. And perhaps this is one of the essential elements of the Pareto efficient frontier, where we're trying to be creative and explore ways to generate clearer and better and even more options. So this is one that all parties would share more or less equally. And how do you do this? You do this in the dialogue with your opponent. Together you explore the issues that you're negotiating and getting a perspective from all sides, the value of those issues and their points of view about the importance of those issues, and thereby trying to figure out what is the potential opportunity for a shared outcome. In other words, you're looking for perhaps some kind of underlying shared or common goal that may not actually be literally articulated in the issues, but maybe is sort of a summation or a theme that the issues are pointing to. The next strategy is to share information. And what information are we talking about here? Key things like underlying interests. Underlying interests are the interests that are associated with the issues that are being negotiated, or some of the other interests connected to the relationship or process, that kind of thing. By sharing these underlying interests, and hopefully your opponent is doing the same thing, you start to understand more about what's really going on in the negotiation and what's important. You want to understand priorities and preferences. This usually comes out when you start talking about interests anyway. So as you start sharing, This will hopefully engage your opponent into sharing as well. The other thing that is sometimes overlooked is a discussion about each person's interpretation of the key facts of the circumstance that's being negotiated. The way each party sees the context and bigger picture and the specific facts so that each person understands what exactly is going on. And there can be some differences. You see this happen quite often when peace treaties are being negotiated between warring countries or warring factions within a country. Are the facts right? How many people have been taken prisoner? How many people perhaps have died in the conflict? How many people were engaged in warfare, and all these other things, that there can be a lot of interpretations of what is real. And so that dialogue alone, in terms of sharing information and understanding each other's interpretations, can be incredibly fruitful for really understanding what the negotiation is truly all about. The next strategy we look at is building trust. Now, in part one, we talked about two different dilemmas. The dilemma of the negotiator, or the negotiator's dilemma, that is the integration or balance perhaps between being competitive or claiming value and being more collaborative and creating value with your opponent. We also talked about the dilemmas of trust and honesty. Well, here we bring it forward again because you can't really have any kind of significant collaboration if there's no trust. Now, there won't be 100% trust necessarily, but without it, you have mistrust, and this inhibits collaboration. Generating trust can be a complex, kind of uncertain process. And then really it depends in large part on how the parties behave and their own personal characteristics. So in order to develop trust well, to develop trust effectively, each party must believe that they and the other party are choosing to behave in some kind of cooperative manner. It can be a bit of trial and error. You try something and you see, because if you don't know your party well, you don't really know what's going to happen, but you can try things and see how the trust is being built. So this strategy of building trust is one that would certainly carry through an entire arc of a negotiation. The next strategy is about making multiple offers simultaneously. Now, what is this all about? What we're doing here is something we sometimes see in automobile dealerships or a lot of business-to-business transactions where people want a particular service and there might be a package involved of different complementary services, or there's a product being sold and there might be different kind of service packages and warranties and this kind of thing. And people aren't really sure. So what sometimes will happen with business-to-business sales or in automobile sales, or you can think of a lot of different situations, they might present you with, for example, with an automobile sale, the sales rep might present you with different financing options or different lease options, down payments of a certain amount or no down payments, or taking into account the value of a trade-in of a vehicle or no trade-in, and so on. There are a lot of different options. I always say be careful about using this too quickly. What can sometimes happen is people don't really have the full creative conversation and the collaborative conversation. And so jump right to making these very concrete offers. It doesn't mean it won't work. It's just that it has to be used judiciously and likely not something you would just lead with. Although I have seen it work where someone might say, here are 3 offerings, what do you think? This exists quite a bit in the consulting world, where they might have some packages listed as part of their offering profile, but then those things are always renegotiated. So it really depends on the context and what you think might be worthwhile. But I always recommend, if you're going into a negotiation that's quite open and there isn't any kind of listed product or service that's been already put out there, then you're starting from scratch, and this is something that really should not be done right away if you're going to have a truly creative and collaborative integrative negotiation. So what happens here? We're providing options that are similar in value and demonstrate flexibility and perceived sincerity. In other words, you're really trying to help your opponent, let's say, reach their goals by offering them options that are of similar value. Then when you get a counteroffer, you can compare it to your original offer. In this way, you can see which of the offers you've provided is closest to matching their preferences. Going a little bit further with this, let's have a look at a specific structure for creating multiple what are called equivalent simultaneous offers. What they mean by equivalent is that they're not identical, but they're very similar in value. So what you want to do is make a comprehensive list of the issues that are going to be negotiated. Again, this is if you're doing it close to the beginning. You want to prioritize those issues and assign a value to each option within each issue. So in other words, which option you're providing as a simultaneous offer that addresses those issues. And then you create 2 to 3 packages with varying terms that collectively are of equal value to you. So you know that whatever you're offering provides the same potential good agreement for you. When you present them, let your opponent or your counterpart know that you are going to make multiple offers. And actually, a lot of people appreciate it. If you're at that stage in the negotiation where you can do this, it's good to tell them, look, why don't we take a look at 2 or 3 different solutions, depending on what your needs might be, and see where they go. If you treat them as options and it's not final offers, you're likely going to be able to continue the dialogue, and it might be really, really helpful to take the dialogue further. You need to be sure that you're communicating that whatever one the person takes, it's completely the same for you, so that they don't feel that you really want them to be pushed into one option or another, because people will sniff that out. And make sure you give them time to consider them. So again, you see this a lot in sales environments. I've used the automobile dealership as an example, but you can see it in so many different ways. And it does occur in business to business. It just typically depends what the context is. The next 3 strategies we're going to look at are finding the motivation and commitment to work together, trying post-settlement settlements, and using clear and accurate communication. We begin with finding the motivation and commitment to work together. When describing this might sound like a combination of 1 or 2 other strategies. And it is probably because, like I said at the beginning, there can be some overlap and interconnectedness between the different strategies with integrative negotiation. So what do we mean by finding motivation and commitment to work together? Well, common fate or outcome. Is there one? Can we demonstrate that there are mutual gains if we work together? So if you go back to the strategy of finding a common goal, that might be one that helps you find the motivation and commitment to work together. Sometimes the party will engage with creating pre-settlement settlements. These are agreements that are reached before the formal negotiation takes place. And these pre-settlement settlements have 3 main characteristics. The first is that this pre-settlement settlement is a finalized written agreement. So one of the things that might be in a pre-settlement settlement has to do with how long decisions might take to occur, or some of the smaller issues that are setting up the bigger negotiation, or it might have to do with time frames, or pauses that are taken, or a whole bunch of things that may have something to do with the process itself, or like I said, tackling the smaller issues before you get to the main negotiation. And what this does is helps to establish a working process and framework and starts to build the relationship and can lead to more confidence in the potential of a shared outcome if it's a very long, protracted negotiation with a lot of different facets in it. The other element or characteristic, that it occurs in advance of the main negotiation. It's understood that this will be replaced by a much more in-depth final agreement. something that's more comprehensive. And then the third characteristic, that it really is only about a subset of issues. As I said earlier, it could be process-related things, it could be smaller issues within the bigger picture, it could be something about the whole framework that needs to be worked out before they get into the nitty-gritty of the main issues of the larger negotiation, whatever it is. So the three main characteristics are that it's a finalized written agreement, that it occurs in advance. Whatever the agreement is, it's going to be replaced, and those terms will be integrated into the new agreement, and that it really focuses on a subset of issues and not the main issues. Otherwise, you're into the main negotiation. So this is what we call pre-settlement settlements. The next one we're going to look at now is trying post-settlement settlements. Now, this would not likely be in a formal plan in advance. Or if it is, only as a backup strategy. We go through a complete negotiation process. This is not a planned option. Just sometimes you get to the end of a negotiation and you want to get that main negotiation or agreement down, but you also have in it an agreement to come back to it, which will allow for further refinements. This is not about opening up the negotiation entirely later on. This is simply that there's certain circumstances you may not be able to agree upon right away. You have the majority of the agreement in place. Certainly all the big issues are resolved. This is simply about perhaps the mechanics of how things are implemented later on, smaller details, maybe some other processes that are unknown at the moment, but that you have the core of the agreement that is solid. The next one is using clear and accurate communication. This strategy, which you could argue maybe could be used in combination with every other strategy, is really about being crystal clear in communication going both ways. So it's not just about what we say, it's also about using active listening, checking things out with your opponent as well, making sure you really understand them. And we want to make sure we use whatever channels we need to ensure that our messaging is consistent and clear. And you do that by checking things out with your opponent too. So again, the understanding is not just about understanding what your opponent is communicating, but also what they're hearing you communicate. So now let's look at the main tactics, and this conversation will be shorter because of the emphasis on communication and understanding. In the book, they don't actually call these tactics per se. They call them ways to generate alternative solutions. But really, you can consider these tactics that you use with the other strategies. So the first one is expanding the pie. Now, you might think this is a strategy because we've talked before. When we looked at the Pareto efficiency model here, right, this process, what we're doing here by creating value, is about expanding the pie. However, to be more specific with how it's used as a tactic, you can use it in ways that are much smaller. It might be just about a part of an issue where you really focus in on that creative conversation, but how do we expand the options and so on with a particular issue or in a particular facet of the negotiation. So that's expanding the pie. We might call this, for the sake of being clear, creating value. Log rolling. This one is often used more than we may even realize. Sometimes we do it without even knowing it. So what we try to do is try to find the issues that are in conflict, that have different priorities for the parties. In part one, we talked about having maybe 6 or 7 issues, and you may find issue number 2 is of paramount importance to you, but it's not as important to your opponent. But maybe item 6 is critically important to your opponent and not that important to you. So what you can do is give in or give a little more on issue 6 and maybe your opponent gives you a little bit more on issue 2. So in that way, you're trading off or rolling a log and exchanging priorities, and perhaps resolving and fulfilling those priorities in a way that is easier than if you just treated them all as equal priorities for both parties. Using non-specific compensation. This one is often misunderstood, so I'll try to be as clear as possible. What this is about is allowing one person to obtain their objectives around a particular issue, having it fulfilled, and then what they do in exchange is pay off the opponent with some form of compensation because they were able to fulfill that need in the negotiation from the other party. Let's take an example, and this is one that's similar to the one in the book. Let's say you're a company and you have some key employees and you work in the heart of a city. Okay, you are the head of the company here. And for economic reasons or practical reasons, you want to move to the suburbs. So that's fine for you and maybe most of your employees, but maybe you have a key employee, maybe a senior person, who was not feeling great about the move. Maybe it's a long distance for them to drive. Maybe they like the neighborhood they're in already where the company's located. Whatever it is. So you try to work it out and there's no way to really get it resolved. So what you might do is say, look, if we move to the suburbs, I know it's a bit of a pain, but we'll provide you with new office furniture of your choosing and maybe one of the nicer offices in the building. So this is not part of the core negotiation of moving to the suburbs, but the payoff, the non-specific compensation at the time is this general idea of new office furniture and a great office space, something like that. So you make that promise. So the person says, okay, I'll agree, I'll move to the suburbs with the company, and that will be the compensation. The next one is cutting the costs for compliance. And this is different from non-specific compensation because you're not providing a payoff. This is simply about cutting the cost of the agreement. So it may mean that in the agreement, you're providing services or products at a certain price point, but you go back and say, how can we reduce our costs internally? Maybe we can somehow save some money and then pass on those costs to our opponent in the negotiation. So cutting the cost for compliance is literally saving money to help the person agree. And this is not something that necessarily will be a tactic that you would plan for. It might be a backup tactic because you can't know in advance if this is even going to be necessary. And you don't want to necessarily go into a negotiation with cutting the cost for compliance as a primary tactic because it's going to unconsciously or even consciously put you in a place where you feel you have to reduce costs and discount. So that's cutting the cost for compliance. And the last main tactic we're going to look at here is something called finding a bridge solution. And this is another one that typically comes up near the end and is not always one you can plan for. It is often considered a backup tactic. This is the kind of thing where you try to reach agreement on all the issues, but you get stuck. So perhaps there's a point in the negotiation where things are getting a little bit bogged down and you go deeper into the interests and you use your creative collaboration dialogue to create new solutions. And you're not discarding the original issues, you're just trying to dig a little deeper into those interests and get more creative. Because often you think you have a full understanding of the interests, and you may up to that point, but there's always another level to explore. Maybe if you really get stuck, the person reveals a whole other level of interest or other agenda or other things going on in the negotiation behind the scenes that all of a sudden opens things up because you realize you can help them with something. I often use the example that when I was working for the real estate developer with medical practitioners and medical businesses, sometimes with big medical practices that we wanted to move into our buildings, the physician groups would say, we have 6 months left on our current lease or a year left on our current lease. And we would offer to pay off that lease with their current landlord so they could move into our building sooner. It got more complicated when they owned their own building. And what we had done on several occasions is purchase that building for them at some kind of assessed market value. And then we would assume the risk to thereby sell the building later on. But in this way, we could accelerate the transaction, have them move into our building, which was of paramount importance, and find a way to get rid of that building later on. And even if we took a loss on the building purchase, it actually still worked out well for us because of the relative value of them moving into our building. It was just so much more than the potential loss on selling a building later on, depending on the market. So the bridge solution was helping them out of their real estate jam or their real estate problem. They wouldn't always tell us, but we would find it out fairly quickly. They would say, we'd like to move, but we'd have to still negotiate all the other elements, the other issues within the process first. And then that would be often an add-on or something that we would have to do that has nothing to do with the core agreement. So that's finding a bridge solution. So those are the main tactics of integrative negotiation. There are a few other things we need to look at, and we're going to do that just briefly here. And before we do that, just to remind ourselves when we look at the Pareto efficiency, that when we're going through and being creative and creating value in a collaborative way here, we have to remember that as we're generating solutions and options, we need to evaluate those solutions. This is part of the claiming value piece, which we cannot forget about. And by evaluating and selecting and then finalizing an agreement on it, we move into the final stages of claiming value from creating value and getting our agreement done. As we're going through this process, through the negotiation and using these tactics along with the other strategies and generating options and solutions for all of the issues, it's time to evaluate and select alternatives. And this is something that is done throughout. So as we go through it, we're constantly evaluating and figuring out which alternatives are best for ourselves. It's important to do this with your opponent as well at different times. It depends on the circumstances and where you are, but you're going to go through this evaluation in an ongoing way anyway. So keep in mind that it's not a sequential step necessarily, but something you need to do as you're doing the creative generative side and expanding the pie by using these different tactics. As we go along, we'll narrow the range of solution options. And of course, we're not just doing that for ourselves, we're doing it with opponents. You'll have your own dialogue internally or with your own team, but this is something that in order to reach an agreement, you need to figure out what that range of solutions might be. You need to evaluate them based on their quality, of course, any kind of objective standards that you have set up with your own team or with your opponent, and the level of acceptability of each of those solutions for the issues. And you will have your own level of acceptability, your own quality associated with that acceptability, and so will your opponent. Other things to do, and these are again not tactics, these are just things that you need to consider. Agreeing to evaluate the criteria in advance. So having rational explanations more than just gut feelings around things, especially if you're working in a team, that everyone understands what the criteria are for agreement on any of the issues. And with that, you want to be able to justify your personal preferences. So when you are having a dialogue with your opponent or opponent team, there needs to be some willingness to explain why you prefer one solution or one outcome over another. It may lead to a conversation again about interests. If you ask the question of your opponent may not want to tell you or may be a bit defensive, but you can just explain it's simply about understanding to help find a mutually beneficial outcome. And the last one here is being alert to the influence of intangibles in selecting options. This may or may not be connected to interests. Typically it's not, at least not interests that you would articulate. Maybe it's about having a good quarter because you're in a sales role and this deal will put you over the top. You might get recognition from your boss. Maybe it's about getting a deal closed in a certain way so you can take more vacation. Whatever it is, there may be all kinds of intangible things behind the scenes. So be aware of your own intangibles and your opponent's. Your opponent may not even know what they are. So it might not be a dialogue you can have, but keep in mind that everyone has other motivations that likely won't be discussed during the negotiation. And with our last screen here, just a few more things we can do to evaluate and select our alternatives. We can use subgroups to evaluate complex options. This is sometimes used for complex union management negotiations, for large negotiations in the resource industries that might involve levels of government if they're doing mining or drilling for oil or something along those lines where many different groups are involved. You may need to have subgroups that pair off and are responsible for evaluating different options. Might be environmental options, there might be economic ones, might be political ones. Not uncommon for complex negotiations. A cool-off period is sometimes helpful, especially if there's a lot of pressure on the negotiation. You see this in business-to-business and retail sales. There's often a cool-off period. What this basically means is it's time available to reconsider. The deal's not completely finalized. This is a process where you like certain things. You just want to think about it a little bit. Sometimes I think of this as another one of those go slow to go fast steps. A little extra time to reconsider, to think about it, and come back with clearer direction typically supports a better long-term agreement. Explore different ways to log roll. Get into it a little more deeply. This is not a separate tactic, but if you can exploit the differences in expectations and the risk and time preferences. In other words, if some person is very risk averse around a particular issue and you're not, take advantage of that together and maybe provide them the security they need and get what you need on another issue. But having the ongoing dialogue and really going deeper into interests and needs and drivers and motivations gives you another opportunity to log roll and make those shifts and exchanges for high priority and lower priority issues a lot more interesting and a lot more effective. Keep everything that is being decided tentative and conditional until it is final and signed. So you can agree to something during a negotiation, but it should be understood that until you actually sign it, both or all parties should have the opportunity to say, I've changed my mind, until everything is completed. Minimize formality and record keeping until the final agreements are closed. During the negotiation, we need to treat everything we're discussing and negotiating as fluid. In other words, not final. So it's not of any real value to have a single stream or a single text documentation of everything that's said in the negotiation throughout the whole thing. Better to save that until the very end to capture the final agreement. During the negotiation, focus on the exchange, the dialogue, the understanding, and take your own notes where you need to. So that caps off what we're talking about here for integrative negotiation. And as you can see, there are specific tactics and others that are just good things to do on an ongoing basis in terms of professional negotiation practice.